"So what's all the fuss about?" the child inquired. There was no malice or irony in her tone, not the slightest implication of blame. She was just asking a simple, straightforward question that called for a simple, straightforward answer. Yes, what was all the fuss about? The snake hadn't bitten him. He hadn't broken his neck. And anyhow, it had all happened yesterday. Today there were these butterflies, this bird that called one to attention, this strange child who talked to one like a Dutch uncle, looked like an angel out of some unfamiliar mythology, and within 5 degrees of the equator was called, believe it or not, MacPhail. Will Farnaby laughed aloud. The little girl clapped her hands and laughed too. A moment later the bird on her shoulder joined in with peal upon peal of loud demonic laughter that filled the glade and echoed among the trees, so that the whole universe seemed to be fairly splitting its sides over the enormous joke of existence. Aldous Huxley's Island, Chapter 3. "Well, I'm glad it's all so amusing," a deep voice suddenly commented. Will Farnaby turned and saw, smiling down at him, a small spare man dressed in European clothes and carrying a black bag. A man, he judged, in his late 50s. Under the wide straw hat the hair was thick and white, and what a strange beaky nose! And the eyes, how incongruously blue in the dark face. "Grandfather!" he heard Mary Sorrigini exclaiming. The stranger turned from Will to the child. "What was so funny?" he asked. "Well," Mary Sorrigini began, and paused for a moment to marshal her thoughts. "Well, you see, he was in a boat, and there was that storm yesterday, and he got wrecked, somewhere down there, so he had to climb up the cliff, and there were some snakes, and he fell down. But luckily there was a tree, so he only had a fright, which is why he was shivering so hard. So I gave him some bananas, and I made him go through it 1,000,000 times. And then all of a sudden he saw that it wasn't anything to worry about. I mean, it's all over and done with. And that made him laugh, and when he laughed, I laughed, and then the myna bird laughed." "Very good," said her grandfather approvingly. "And now," he added, turning back to Will Farnaby, "after the psychological first aid, let's see what can be done for poor old brother Ass. I'm Dr. Robert MacPhail, by the way. Who are you?" "His name's Will," said Mary Sorrigini before the young man could answer. "And his other name is Far something." "Farnaby, to be precise. William Asquith Farnaby. My father, as you might guess, was an ardent liberal, even when he was drunk, especially when he was drunk." He gave vent to a harsh, derisive laugh, strangely unlike the full-throated merriment which had greeted his discovery that there was really nothing to make a fuss about. "Didn't you like your father?" Mary Sorrigini asked with concern. "Not as much as I might have," Will answered. "What he means," Dr. MacPhail explained to the child, "is that he hated his father. A lot of them do," he added parenthetically. Squatting down on his haunches, he began to undo the straps of his black bag. "One of our ex-imperialists, I assume," he said over his shoulder to the young man. "Born in Bloomsbury," Will confirmed. "Upper class," the doctor diagnosed, "but not a member of the military or county subspecies." "Correct. My father was a barrister and political journalist, that is, when he wasn't too busy being an alcoholic. My mother, incredible as it may seem, was the daughter of an archdeacon." "An archdeacon," he repeated, and laughed again, as he had laughed over his father's taste for brandy. Dr. MacPhail looked at him for a moment, then turned his attention once more to the straps. "When you laugh like that," he remarked in a tone of scientific detachment, "your face becomes curiously ugly." Taken aback, Will tried to cover his embarrassment with a piece of facetiousness. "It's always ugly," he said. "On the contrary, in a Baudelairean sort of way, it's rather beautiful. Except when you choose to make noises like a hyena. Why do you make those noises?" "I'm a journalist," Will explained. "Our special correspondent, paid to travel about the world and report on the current horrors. What other kind of noise do you expect me to make? Cuckoo, blah blah, marks marks." He laughed again, then brought out one of his well-tried witticisms. "I'm the man who won't take yes for an answer." "Pretty," said Dr. MacPhail. "Very pretty, but now let's get down to business." Taking a pair of scissors out of his bag, he started to cut away the torn and blood-stained trouser leg that covered Will's injured knee. Will Farnaby looked up at him and wondered, as he looked, how much of this improbable Highlander was still Scottish and how much Palanese. About the blue eyes and the jutting nose there could be no doubt, but the brown skin, the delicate hands, the grace of movement, these surely came from somewhere considerably south of the Tweed. "Were you born here?" he asked. The doctor nodded affirmatively. "At Shivapuram, on the day of Queen Victoria's funeral." There was a final click of the scissors, and the trouser leg fell away, exposing the knee. "Messy," was Dr. MacPhail's verdict after a first intense scrutiny, "but I don't think there's anything too serious." He turned to his granddaughter. "I'd like you to run back to the station and ask Vijaya to come here with one of the other men. Tell them to pick up a stretcher at the infirmary." Mary Sorgini nodded and, without a word, rose to her feet and hurried away across the glade. Will looked after the small figure as it receded, the red skirt swinging from side to side, the smooth skin of the torso glowing rosily golden in the sunlight. "You have a very remarkable granddaughter," he said to Dr. MacPhail. "Mary Sorgini's father," said the doctor after a little silence, "was my eldest son. He died 4 months ago, a mountain climbing accident." Will mumbled his sympathy, and there was another silence. Dr. MacPhail uncorked a bottle of alcohol and swabbed his hands. "This is going to hurt a bit," he warned. "I'd suggest that you listen to that bird." He waved a hand in the direction of the dead tree, to which, after Mary Sorgini's departure, the miner had returned. "Listen to him closely. Listen discriminatingly. It'll keep your mind off the discomfort." Will Farnaby listened. The miner had gone back to its first theme. "Attention!" the articulate oboe was calling. "Attention!" "Attention to what?" he asked, in the hope of eliciting a more enlightening answer than the one he had received from Mary Sorgini. "To attention," said Dr. MacPhail. "Attention to attention." "Of course." "Attention," the miner chanted in ironical confirmation. "Do you have many of these talking birds?" "There must be at least 1,000 of them flying about the island. It was the old Rajah's idea. He thought it would do people good. Maybe it does, though it seems rather unfair to the poor miners. Fortunately, however, birds don't understand pep talks, not even St. Francis's. Just imagine," he went on, "preaching sermons to perfectly good thrushes and goldfinches and chiffchaffs. What presumption! Why couldn't he have kept his mouth shut and let the birds preach to him? And now," he added in another tone, "you'd better start listening to our friend in the tree. I'm going to clean this thing up." "Attention! Here goes." The young man winced and bit his lip. "Attention! Attention! Attention!" Yes, it was quite true. If you listened intently enough, the pain wasn't so bad. "Attention! Attention!" "How you ever contrived to get up that cliff," said Dr. MacPhail as he reached for the bandage, "I cannot conceive." Will managed to laugh. "Remember the beginning of Erewhon," he said. "As luck would have it, Providence was on my side." From the further side of the glade came the sound of voices. Will turned his head and saw Mary Sorgini emerging from between the trees, her red skirt swinging as she skipped along. Behind her, naked to the waist and carrying over his shoulder the bamboo poles and rolled up canvas of a light stretcher, walked a huge bronze statue of a man, and behind the giant came a slender dark-skinned adolescent in white shorts. "This is Vijaya Bhattacharya," said Dr. MacPhail as the bronze statue approached. "Vijaya is my assistant." "In the hospital?" Dr. MacPhail shook his head. "Except in emergencies," he said. "I don't practice anymore. Vijaya and I work together at the agricultural experimental station. And Murugan Mylendra," he waved his hand in the direction of the dark-skinned boy, "is with us temporarily, studying soil science and plant breeding." Vijaya stepped aside and, laying a large hand on his companion's shoulder, pushed him forward. Looking up into that beautiful, sulky young face, Will suddenly recognised, with a start of surprise, the elegantly tailored youth he had met 5 days before at Rendang Lobo, have driven with in Colonel Dipper's white Mercedes all over the island. He smiled. He opened his mouth to speak, then checked himself. Almost imperceptibly, but quite unmistakably, the boy had shaken his head. In his eyes Will saw an expression of anguished pleading. His lips moved soundlessly. "Please," he seemed to be saying. "Please." Will readjusted his face. "How do you do, Mr. Mylendra?" he said in a tone of casual formality. Murrigan looked enormously relieved. "How do you do?" he said, and made a little bow. Will looked round to see if the others had noticed what had happened. Mary, Sarojini and Vijaya, he saw, were busy with the stretcher, and the doctor was repacking his black bag. The little comedy had been played without an audience. Young Murrigan evidently had his reasons for not wanting it to be known that he had been in Rendang. Boys will be boys. Boys will even be girls. Colonel Dipper had been more than fatherly towards his young protege, and towards the colonel, Murrigan had been a good deal more than filial. He had been positively adoring. Was it merely hero worship? Merely a schoolboy's admiration for the strong man who had carried out a successful revolution, liquidated the opposition, and installed himself as dictator? Or were other feelings involved? Was Murrigan playing Antinous to his black-moustached Hadrian? Well, if that was how he felt about middle-aged military gangsters, that was his privilege, and if the gangster liked pretty boys, that was his. And perhaps, Will went on to reflect, that was why Colonel Dipper had refrained from making a formal introduction. "This is Muru," was all he had said, when the boy was ushered into the presidential office. "My young friend Muru." And he had risen, had put his arm around the boy's shoulders, had led him to the sofa and sat down beside him. "May I drive the Mercedes?" Murrigan had asked. The dictator had smiled indulgently and nodded his sleek black head. And that was another reason for thinking that more than mere friendliness was involved in that curious relationship. At the wheel of the colonel's sports car, Murrigan was a maniac. Only an infatuated lover would have entrusted himself, not to mention his guest, to such a chauffeur. On the flat between Rendang Lobo and the oil fields, the speedometer had twice touched 110, and worse, much worse, was to follow on the mountain road from the oil fields to the copper mines. Chasms yawned, tyres screeched round corners, water buffaloes emerged from bamboo thickets a few feet ahead of the car. 10-ton lorries came roaring down on the wrong side of the road. "Aren't you a little nervous?" Will had ventured to ask. But the gangster was pious as well as infatuated. "If one knows that one is doing the will of Allah, and I do know it, Mr. Farnaby, there is no excuse for nervousness. In those circumstances, nervousness would be blasphemy." And as Murrigan swerved to avoid yet another buffalo, he opened his gold cigarette case and offered Will a Balkan Sobranjo. "Ready," Vijaya called. Will turned his head and saw the stretcher lying on the ground beside him. "Good," said Dr. MacPhail. "Let's lift him onto it. Carefully." Carefully.